Hello everyone, and this is Phoenix here, and today is going to be Strange Origins of Video Games Part 2. Now I have a feeling that not many people watched the first part, mainly because I uploaded it in a really odd time where it was in the middle of the anime feature I was doing. So let me explain briefly what this whole video series is all about, in case you haven't watched the first part, but don't worry, I'll link it in the description just in case. So the point of Strange Origins of Video Games is that there's a lot of series out there that may be pretty confusing for newer fans. And what I mean by confusing is that it could be like an odd release order, like having a series that started out having numbers, but then they just have subtitles but get rid of the numbers. Or some games may only be released in Japan, but they do happen to bring out the other games, making it a gap in the series. Or some might just have different names all around together. And sometimes I'll talk about the different name changes within different regions. But that is just the basic of various reasons of how a game could be confusing for a newer fan to get into, to know where they want to start playing a game series at. So I went through quite a bit of them last time, so here I'm going to be talking about even more. But before we start, I gotta clear up one thing, and that happened to be something that I talked about within the first video. And well, as you know, I made a mistake. I know I'm not perfect or anything like that, and in fact I'm sure it was bound to happen eventually anyway. But the correction really isn't anything that huge, but I might as well mention it here. Now in the first video, there was one part where I talked about the Shin Megami Tensei series, well just the regular one, not like any of the other series that go along within it. And as I said in that video, it started off with Shin Megami Tensei, then Shin Megami Tensei 2, which were only released in Japan on the Super Famicom, and then Shin Megami Tensei 3 was released over here, but it was called Nocturne. And I also explained that in Japan they actually re-released this game 2 times. So there's 3 versions of Nocturne within Japan, but we only got the second version that came out. So anyways, the mistake that I made within that video was that apparently there's 2 other games that did come out before the first one, and well, I was aware of them at the time. I actually knew exactly what they were, but I didn't really feel like mentioning them, mainly because of the fact that their names were different. But there are 2 Famicom games called Megami Tensei Digital Devil Story 1 and 2. And like I said, the titles are different, where normally it's called Shin Megami Tensei, but this time they're just called Megami Tensei, but then they just had the word Digital Devil Story at the end. So it wasn't that I forgot about them, it was just like I already said, I just didn't really feel like mentioning it because it doesn't really feel like it's really a part of this main series. But it was the main starting point where the series began, so yeah, you know what, maybe I should have just mentioned that just to make things more clear. But either way though, I couldn't even find an English translation for these 2 games anyway, so yeah, you can't even play them, unless maybe I'm just not looking in the right direction. And there was another game that was also pointed out to me that I also forgot about, and this one happened between Nocturne and Shin Megami Tensei 4, and that one happened to be Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey on the DS. And as again, I was aware of this game, but the main thing that did confuse me with it was that I wasn't sure if it was a part of the main series or not. I thought it was just some random game that they just happened to make. But during the time when this game was released, well, before it was released, this game was considered as Shin Megami Tensei 4. But now that they actually have a game called Shin Megami Tensei 4 on the 3DS, it kind of makes that argument of making this game number 4 irrelevant. But yes, it is the 4th game in the Shin Megami Tensei regular series, but they just didn't call it 4. So for that reason, I didn't know what the fuck it was all about. And it also doesn't help that I never even played this one before. But either way, it is a part of the main series, it just doesn't have a number in it. I guess you could call it Shin Megami Tensei 3.5. So now that I got that cleared up, let's begin already. Now there's a good chance that you might have seen this game before called Rival Turf. I think one of the main reasons why this game is pretty well known is probably has to do with the fact that it has a really ugly box art and it's just very early 90s. So yeah, whatever, the cover's fucking ugly, alright? So anyways, did you know that this game is actually a part of a series of 3 games called Russian Beat? Well, that's what the series is called in Japan, but over here in North America, they were all released with 3 different names, and Rival Turf was the first one. So the second game in the series was called Brawl Brothers, and even though the cover in this one is still pretty ridiculous looking, it's at least a better improvement of the first one. And then the last one in the series was called Peacekeepers. So there is a good chance that people might have not known that these 3 games were even related to each other, except for the fact that they were developed and published by Jellicoe, unless you've actually played 1 and 2, where it actually still has the same 2 characters, most recognizably the one that looks like M. Bison. So yeah, that's Russian Beat for you. So now we're going to be talking about the Saga series, which was developed by Square. Now there's a good chance that you've probably heard of a game called Saga Frontier 1 and 2 on the PlayStation. Now just from looking at the title, this is the first game to be released over here in North America in the Saga series. But actually, there were 3 other ones, but they were on the Game Boy, and they had different names. In fact, the names were actually considered with another series, which I'll talk about, and it's none other than Final Fantasy Legends 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, there happens to be a Saga game, but then got renamed to a Final Fantasy game. And in Japan, these were the first Saga games to ever come out, but when they released them over here, they just renamed it to Final Fantasy, due to the fact that Final Fantasy was a huge hit over here. So for marketing reasons, they decided to call it the Final Fantasy Legends series. And you may be wondering, what about Final Fantasy Adventure on the Game Boy? I mean, this game looks exactly like the other ones due to its box art, except it's green. And funny enough, this game was actually another series of games that got brought over here but is renamed to Final Fantasy Adventure. And that one happened to be a part of the Mana series. And what makes this even weirder, in Europe, the game was called Mystic Quest, not to be confused with the Mystic Quest that we got over here. So the Super Nintendo game in Europe was not called Mystic Quest, but Mystic Quest Legends. So it's kind of weird how the Saga series kind of branched out in that sort of way. In fact, I haven't got a chance to talk about Romancing Saga, which there happens to be 3 of them on the Super Famicom. Unfortunately, they weren't released outside Japan. However, there was a PS2 version, it happens to be a remake of the first game that happened to come out over here. And of course there are spin-offs, but I won't really get into that. Then again, it's not like there's that much of them anyway. So yeah, there's a good chance that you might have been playing a Final Fantasy game, but it was actually a Saga game in disguise. Have you ever heard of a game on the Super Nintendo that happens to be really crazy looking called the Ninja Warriors? Well, if you have, it was the only one that got released over here in North America. But the first game in the series just happened to be called the same name, the Ninja Warriors. But it was on a ton of systems, such as the Arcade, TurboGrafx CD, Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, the Amiga, Atari ST, and finally, the Sega CD, but all of these were only in Japan. But the Ninja Warrior game that we got was actually only released on the Super Nintendo, and in Japan it was called the Ninja Warriors again. Unfortunately, they never made another one after that, but at least this one isn't too confusing. It's really just 2 games. But there's a good chance we might not have played the first one, unless you just use an emulator for it, or just get yourself an import copy. But I still consider this to be a strange origin within itself. So now we're going to take a look at the Tales of series. Now there's a lot of games within this series as a whole, but most of them don't connect to each other unless they have a number in the title. But the one that I'm specifically looking at is Tales of Destiny. This was the first Tales of game to be released here in North America, but it was the second Tales of game to be released here as a whole, the first one being Tales of Fantasia. But like I said, I'm only focusing on Tales of Destiny because this one it gets kind of weird because there's actually Tales of Destiny 2, but it's actually not related to the Tales of Destiny that we first got. Because Tales of Destiny 2 in Japan is called Tales of Eternia. My guess is the reason why they called this one Tales of Destiny 2 over here is because they were thinking about just calling the entire series in general Tales of Destiny, let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, but that ended up not happening. But the other thing that makes this one so damn weird is that there is actually another game called Tales of Destiny 2, and this Tales of Destiny is actually connected to the first Tales of Destiny, but it was never released outside Japan, so it's not like we could have played it. But I'm sure if it did come out over here, it would just be really weird if they called it Tales of Destiny 2 as well, because then there would be 2 of them with the same name. But they did do a remake of Tales of Eternia on the PSP, but unfortunately that one never came out over here in North America, but it did come out in the PAL regions and it is in English. Therefore, it is possible to own a Tales of Eternia game without it being called Tales of Destiny 2. So that's all you really need to know about Tales of Destiny and Tales of Eternia because, you know, they're just so mixed in with each other. But there is a shitload of other games, but thankfully they never had this issue. So here's a game series that I've already talked about within one of my reviews, but I figured I might as well mention it here just in case. That happens to be the Puzzle Boys series, which some of them were released over here, but they had different titles. So the original Puzzle Boy game that was released over here was called Quirk, and for some reason they ended up changing the P.T.O character into a tomato character. And then there was Puzzle Boys on this Famicom disk system, but because of that it never came out over here. And then there's Spud's Adventure, which I happened to do a review on that one. And then there's Puzzle Boy on the TurboGrafx. Now I find it funny that the one on the disc system was called Puzzle Boys, but this one's just called Puzzle Boy. And they were both released only in Japan, so, at least we won't get confused with that one. But then they make a Puzzle Boy 2, but in this one they released it over here in English, and it is Amazing Tater. So really, there's only 3 games that ever came out here in North America. But I figured I might as well expand a little bit about it in here rather than in the review. But the game Quirk is the one that kinda seems a bit out of place compared to the other ones, where at least with Amazing Tater and Spud's Adventure, the 2 guys on the cover look the same. So yes, it's another series that got released over here with different names. Now, have you ever heard of a game that happened to look exactly like Indiana Jones called Ernest Evans? In North America, it was only released on the Sega Genesis. On Japan, it was only released on the Sega CD. But this game actually goes in between 2 other games, believe it or not. And the first game in the series happened to be El Viento. That one was also released for the Sega Genesis. And then the third game was only released on the Sega CD in Japan. It was called Annette Again. Yeah, it's unfortunate we never got this one. But as again, this one isn't too confusing, but the names are pretty much really different from each other. And if you didn't know this, there's a good chance you might not have drawn a connection between these 2 games. Or 3 if you include the Japanese one. Now this is a pretty obscure one. There's a series made by the company Koei called P.T.O. It's a strategy game very similar to a lot of other ones that they used to do a lot, such as Romance of the 3 Kingdoms, Nobunaga's Ambitions, and a couple of other ones. It was on a couple of different systems like the PC-88, the Sharp C8000, the MSX, the Super Nintendo, and the Genesis. And there are 4 games within the series, but the one thing that makes this one so weird is the numbering. So first, obviously, you got P.T.O, then there's P.T.O 2, which was only released on PC, DOS, Super Nintendo, and the Sega Saturn. And then the third game was never released over here, but that one was for Windows, the PC 9801, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation. And then the 4th game, which did come out over here, was called P.T.O 4. So they skipped 3, but when the 4th one came out, they still called it 4. And that's just really strange. Although this one also was on less systems, such as it was only on PC and PlayStation 2. Now as for another thing that is related to this, it is also really weird that has to do with number 3, is that there's another series that Koei made called Genghis Khan. And there are 4 titles within this game, but the first one was only released in Japan. And the second one was the first one to be released over here, but it was just called Genghis Khan. And then the third game was called Genghis Khan 2, Clan of the Grey Wolf, which also came out over here. And then there's a 4th game, and they actually do call it number 4, but it was never released over here. So they have 1 and 2, then they skip number 3, and then they just call the 4th one, well, just number 4. So it seemed like Koei did not like having the number 3 in their titles back then. Now as weird as it is, maybe Valve might take some notes on this, and actually release a 3rd game but without calling it number 3. But all jokes aside, this is pretty fucked up. Now here's a weird one. There's a PlayStation 2 and Wii game called Baroque, and it's a hybrid between an RPG and a roguelike. It's a very strange game within itself. But did you know that this game was actually a remake? Yeah, the original version was actually for the Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1, and it was only released in Japan, but it had the exact same name. And there's actually some differences between the 2 versions, where the original version was actually in a first-person view, where the remake one that came out over here was actually in third person. But still, I thought it was interesting to know that this game was actually a remake, because when I first picked this game up, I had no idea that it was even a remake at all. But yep, it's just a remake, but we didn't get the original version. And now we're going to take a look at the Atelier series, or the Atelier series, I don't fucking know what to call it. I'm not good at French here, okay? But I think Atelier sounds better, but either way, that's not the point here. So anyways, the way how this series works is that they usually release 3 or 2 games within a series that tells the same story, but then they release like another set of 3 games that tells a different story, but it still has the same basic premise. But the first one that ever came out over here in North America was Atelier Iris series. And then there's the Arland series, which the 3 of them here as again. And just recently, they just finished up the Dusk series. And they are working on another one, but it hasn't been announced what the series is called yet, so we won't count that one just yet. But there was one other series that actually happened between Iris and Arland. But instead of 3, there was only 2, and that series happened to be Mana Chemia. And they call it the Mana series. Not to be confused with the Mana series from Squaresoft, but just from reading the English titles, it doesn't seem like it's a part of the series, but it actually is. But in fact, the series is actually much older than the Iris series, because there's two of them that never got released over here. So the very first game in the series in total is actually Atelier Marie, the Alchemist of Salberg, which was only released for the PlayStation 1. And there was 3 games in the Salberg series, but one of them was on the PlayStation 2. And then the last one to be exclusive to Japan was the Gramad series. I don't think I pronounced that one right, but you know what? Who the fuck cares? But just like Manikamia, this one only has 2, and it was only for PlayStation 2. Now there's a lot of side games, spin-offs, and special remakes and whatnot, but I'm not going to get into all that because, you know, that's just too nutty for me. But it is interesting to note that the game series has been on other consoles other than PlayStation. Some of them have been on Game Boy Color, Sega Saturn, Dreamcast, Windows, the WonderSwan Color, and even a system I'd never even heard of called Easy, so I found that to be pretty neat within this series. So before we end things, we're going to take a look at one more series, and this one is a pretty big one, I'd say so myself, and it happens to be the East series, or YS is what I used to call it before I knew how to say it. Sometimes when I'm actually talking to people about it, I'd always have to tell them, oh, it's the YS series, and then it's like, oh yeah, I know that one. So anyways, there's quite a few games within this series, but we'll start from the beginning. So the original game was Ancient East Vanished, and it was released for a shit ton of computer systems, and it was only released in Japan. But it was available on consoles such as the Famicom, but that was also in Japan. But there is one version that you can play on a console in North America, and that happens to be on the Master System, but it was called Ys the Vanished Omens. And there's a lot of remakes too, but I'll get into those a little bit. Now as for the second game, it was called Ancient Ys Vanished 2, the final chapter. Now what they mean by the final chapter is not the ending of the series in general, but the ending of the Vanished saga. But as again, this game was released on a shit ton of systems. But one thing that is interesting to note is that it's actually more common to see Ys 1 and 2 together than separate, because originally on the TurboGrafx 16, or to be more accurate, the CD add-on for it, there was Ys Books 1 and 2. So if you grew up with the TurboGrafx, there's a good chance that you might have thought that this was the very first game. Now as for the remake, there was actually a DS version, and this one was a little different because they actually switched the gameplay style to play more like Zelda, where normally the gameplay style originally was sort of like Hide-a-Lide but much better. But one thing I do find amusing about the DS version is that in Japan, they got 2 separate releases, meaning that it was 2 different games entirely. But when it came out over here, we actually got 2 games on one cart. Fucking awesome, eh? And then there's the PSP remake, which was called Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles. Most people are familiar with the PSP remakes, mainly because you can actually play most of them on PSP. And then there's Ys 3, Wanderers from Ys. As again, it's on a shit ton of systems, but it did get released over here on more systems such as the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, and the TurboGrafx CD. And as for the remake, it did get one on the PSP, but it was called Ys the Oath of Felghana. No number in the title, so just so you know, this is Ys 3, in case you didn't know. And as for Ys 4, this one is kind of a clusterfuck for many different reasons. So one of the reasons is that there's 2 different Ys games that were being developed around the same time by 2 different companies, and none of them were being developed by the usual company Nihon Falcom. So one of them is called Ys 4 Mask of the Sun, which was for the Super Nintendo and a remake for PS2, but they were both only in Japan. Luckily, there is a fan translation out there for this one. Now, the original version of this game was being developed by Advanced Communication. Now, as for the other Ys 4, it was called Ys 4 Dawn of Ys. And this one was only on the PC Engine, also known as the TurboGrafx in Japan. And believe it or not, this one never got a remake, and this one was developed by Hudson Soft. So originally, Nihon Falcom pretty much just skipped 4 and just moved on to 5 for some whatever reason. But much later on, they did eventually make a Ys 4, but it was on the Vita, and it was called Ys Memories of Callista. And as again, this one does not have a number in it, meaning that there's no way to know if it actually was a remake of 4 unless you dig into it a little bit. But yes, this is their own version of number 4. And as for the 5th game, they ended up calling it Ys 5 Lost Kefin Kingdom of Sand. This one was released originally for the Super Nintendo and a remake for PlayStation 2, but unfortunately, only in Japan. Now I believe there was an English translation for this game, but I never played it myself, but I think it is 100% done, but I'm not entirely sure. But unfortunately, there was never an actual game to be released in North America yet. But hopefully soon we might see one someday. And as for the 6th game, it actually was released over here on PlayStation 2, but it was not called 6, but it was called Ys the Ark of Nepishtim. Man, that sounded really funny the way I said that. But this one you can get on PS2 and PSP, but the PSP version is not really much of a remake, but it's more of a port, more or less. And then there's one more PSP game, but this one is not a remake, but it's actually an original game on there called Ys 7. Yeah, it's really weird that they called it that when yet some of the other ones weren't even numbered, or not even on the PSP or the Vita yet at all. But yes, you can pretty much get almost every single Ys game on the PSP, which is pretty awesome. Now there is one other main title game, but I figured I might as well mention it here, since it's not really so much a spin-off. It is a part of the main story, but it's actually a prequel to the entire thing, but it was called Ys Origins, and it was only released on PC. I figured I'd mention that just in case someone wants to look into the series and wants to start from all the way back from the beginning. But yes, the series can be a bit confusing if you don't know much about it, because like I said, some of them are numbered, some of them are not, and they release them on a lot of different systems, so of course it's pretty spread out. Now I have heard that they are making one on the PlayStation Vita and the PlayStation 4, but not much is said about it other than those two things. But it's interesting because it's just been such a long time since the Ys game has came out on a console in North America, so I can't wait for that one to get an official release date. But anyways, I'm pretty much done talking about the Ys series, and hopefully you might have learned something from this. I know I learn about these things pretty often whenever I find a new game and it just happens to be related to something else. It's a really nice feeling brain buzz, if that makes sense. But as you can tell, like I've already said in the part 1, I love this kind of shit. But like I said about part 1, feel free to give me more ideas for doing a part 3. There are still more of them out there, but of course, maybe there's something out there that you know that I don't. Now just before I end things here, I'm going to give credit to 2 people that inspired me to come up with this kind of idea. So the first one I want to mention is AVGN when he did the Chronology Confused video, which was very entertaining as usual. And then there's NecroVMX who did the Clearing Confusion series, which is also pretty damn entertaining. So if you like this kind of stuff but never seen those two, then I recommend you guys to watch them. But now I'm going to end things, so thank you for watching and commenting.